This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, April 2007. Summer by Edith Wharton. Chapter 18. They began to jog down the winding road to the valley at old Dan's languid pace. Charity felt herself sinking into deeper depths of weariness, and as they descended through the bare woods there were moments when she lost the exact sense of things, and seemed to be sitting beside her lover with the leafy arch of summer bending over them. But this illusion was faint and transitory. For the most part she had only a confused sensation of slipping down a smooth, irresistible current, and she abandoned herself to the feeling as a refuge from the torment of thought. Mr. Royal seldom spoke, but his silent presence gave her, for the first time, a sense of peace and security. She knew that where he was there would be warmth, rest, silence. And for the moment they were all she wanted. She shut her eyes, and even these things grew dim to her. In the train, during the short run from Creston to Nettleton, the warmth aroused her, and the consciousness of being under strange eyes gave her a momentary energy. She sat upright, facing Mr. Royal, and stared out of the window at the denuded country. 48 hours earlier, when she had last traversed it, many of the trees still held their leaves, but the high wind of the last 2 nights had stripped them, and the lines of the landscape were as finely penciled as in December. A few days of autumn cold had wiped out all trace of the rich fields and languid groves through which she had passed on the 4th of July. And with the fading of the landscape those fervid hours had faded too. She could no longer believe that she was the being who had lived them. She was someone to whom something irreparable and overwhelming had happened, but the traces of the steps leading up to it had almost vanished. When the train reached Nettleton, and she walked out into the square at Mr. Royal's side, the sense of unreality grew more overpowering. The physical strain of the night and day had left no room in her mind for new sensations, and she followed Mr. Royal as passively as a tired child. As in a confused dream, she presently found herself sitting with him in a pleasant room, at a table with a red and white tablecloth, on which hot food and tea were placed. He filled her cup and plate, and whenever she lifted her eyes from them, she found his resting on her with the same steady, tranquil gaze that had reassured and strengthened her when they had faced each other in old Mrs. Hobart's kitchen. As everything else in her consciousness grew more and more confused and immaterial, became more and more like the universal shimmer that dissolves the world to failing eyes, Mr. Royal's presence began to detach itself with rocky firmness from this elusive background. She had always thought of him, when she thought of him at all, as of someone hateful and obstructive, but whom she could outwit and dominate when she chose to make the effort. Only once, on the day of the Old Home Week celebration, while the stray fragments of his address drifted across her troubled mind, had she caught a glimpse of another being, a being so different from the dull-witted enemy with whom she had supposed herself to be living, that even through the burning mist of her own dreams he had stood out with startling distinctness. For a moment, then, what he said, and something in his way of saying it, had made her see why he had always struck her as such a lonely man. But the mist of her dreams had hidden him again, and she had forgotten that fugitive impression. It came back to her now, as they sat at the table, and gave her, through her own immeasurable desolation, a sudden sense of their nearness to each other. But all these physical feelings were only brief streaks of light in the grey blur of her physical weakness. Through it she was aware that Mr. Royal presently left her sitting by the table in the warm room, and came back after an interval with the carriage from the station, a closed hack, with sunburnt blue silk blinds, in which they drove together to a house covered with creepers, and standing next to a church with a carpet of turf before it. They got out at this house, and the carriage waited while they walked up the path and entered a wainscoted hall, and then a room full of books. In this room a clergyman whom Charity had never seen received them pleasantly, and asked them to be seated for a few minutes while witnesses were being summoned. Charity sat down obediently, and Mr. Royal, his hands behind his back, paced slowly up and down the room. As he turned and faced Charity, she noticed that his lips were twitching a little, but the look in his eyes was grave and calm. Once he paused before her and said timidly, "Your hair's got kind o' loose with the wind," and she lifted her hands and tried to smooth back the locks that had escaped from her braid. There was a looking-glass in a carved frame on the wall, but she was ashamed to look at herself in it, and she sat with her hands folded on her knee till the clergyman returned. Then they went out again, along a sort of arcaded passage, and into a low vaulted room, with a cross on an altar, and rows of benches. The clergyman, who had left them at the door, presently reappeared before the altar in a surplice, and a lady who was probably his wife, and a man in a blue shirt who had been raking dead leaves on the lawn, came in and sat on one of the benches. The clergyman opened a book and signed to Charity and Mr. Royal to approach. Mr. Royal advanced a few steps, and Charity followed him as she had followed him to the buggy when they went out of Mrs. Hobart's kitchen. She had the feeling that if she ceased to keep close to him and do what he told her to do, the world would slip away from beneath her feet. The clergyman began to read, and on her dazed mind there rose the memory of Mr. Miles, standing the night before in the desolate house of the mountain, and reading out of the same book words that had the same dread sound of finality. "I require and charge you both, as you will answer at the dreadful day of judgment, when the secrets of all hearts shall be disclosed, that if either of you know any impediment whereby ye may not be lawfully joined together—" Charity raised her eyes and met Mr. Royal's. They were still looking at her kindly and steadily. "I will," she heard him say a moment later, after another interval of words that she had failed to catch. She was so busy trying to understand the gestures that the clergyman was signalling to her to make, that she no longer heard what was being said. After another interval the lady on the bench stood up, and taking her hand put it in Mr. Royal's. It lay enclosed in his strong palm, and she felt a ring that was too big for her being slipped on her thin finger. She understood then that she was married. Late that afternoon, Charity sat alone in a bedroom of the fashionable hotel where she and Harney had vainly sought a table on the 4th of July. She had never before been in so handsomely furnished a room. The mirror above the dressing-table reflected the high headboard and fluted pillow-slips of the double bed, and a bedspread so spotlessly white that she hesitated to lay her hat and jacket on it. The humming radiator diffused an atmosphere of drowsy warmth, and through a half-open door she saw the glitter of the nickel taps above twin marble basins. For a while the long turmoil of the night and day had slipped away from her, and she sat with closed eyes, surrendering herself to the spell of warmth and silence. But presently this merciful apathy was succeeded by the sudden acuteness of vision with which sick people sometimes wake out of a heavy sleep. As she opened her eyes, they rested on the picture that hung above the bed. It was a large engraving with a dazzling white margin enclosed in a white frame of bird's-eye maple with an inner scroll of gold. The engraving represented a young man in a boat on a lake overhung with trees. He was leaning over to gather water-lilies for the girl in a light dress who lay among the cushions in the stern. The scene was full of a drowsy midsummer radiance, and Charity averted her eyes from it, and rising from her chair, began to wander restlessly about the room. It was on the 5th floor, and its broad window of plate glass looked over the roofs of the town. Beyond them stretched a wooded landscape in which the last fires of sunset were picking out a steely gleam. Charity gazed at the gleam with startled eyes. Even through the gathering twilight she recognized the contour of the soft hills encircling it, and the way the meadows sloped to its edge. It was Nettleton Lake that she was looking at. She stood a long time in the window staring out at the fading water. The sight of it had roused her for the first time to a realization of what she had done. Even the feeling of the ring on her hand had not brought her this sharp sense of the irretrievable. For an instant the old impulse of flight swept through her, but it was only the lift of a broken wing. She heard the door open behind her, and Mr. Royal came in. He had gone to the barber's to be shaved, and his